offline anymore. I don't think offline exists anymore. That's a term we need to get rid of. When we were talking about, the stratosphere and the zoomosphere, and this is where we all meet. So welcome this morning. I really think this is a very applicable and challenging theme, I would say, which is organizational resilience. Now, I see when they sent me the theme, they said the cure for COVID-19 lockdown. Yeah, I think that's a heavy shopping list. I think what we should say is, part of how to deal with this, going forward, because our worlds have been rocked. I'll share with you one thing before I dive into the next slide, ladies and gentlemen, and that is that I think all of us in business have now got to get rid of the fallacy of control. It doesn't exist. You know, I think this pandemic has shown us that we are all very vulnerable. Most of our businesses, if not all, were absolutely not prepared with contingency planning. And I think there's a lot of scratching around, just to break even possibly or reduce the level of losses that we are taking. But it's very reactive. And I think the talk this morning is very much about going into that more proactive sphere of business management and leadership. So let's go to next slide. Good. So let me see if I've got control over this thing. There we go. So ladies and gentlemen, I looked around in my preparation for this talk, and I picked on two standards generating bodies, because I like to go back to standards when we talk about managerial science issues such as business resilience or organizational resilience. And the reason being that there's been so much thought that has gone into these standards that we can really learn quite a lot from them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So this one I found in BS 65,000, which is BSI is the British Standards Institution. You may want to go and Google these guys. And they provide us with a lovely definition for organizational resilience. And they say it's the ability of an organization to anticipate while we weren't anticipating, prepare for, I don't think we were prepared, to respond, well, this is what we are trying to do now, and then adapt. So probably the adapt part is what we as businesses will have to focus on, let's say at least for the next 2 years, apart from adapting in the very short run, which is current. But my talk is more about looking at organizational resilience from a strategic perspective going forward. So they also then talk about incremental change, which we know COVID definitely did not bring about, but a sudden disruption. And then they say just not in order to survive, but also to prosper. So go and have a look at this standard. It's quite interesting. There's also a white paper, and I'm going to return to this standard towards the end of this particular segment of the conversation, because it should become an organization-wide philosophy, number one. Number two, then it should become practice, operational practice, not just strategic practice. So this is what BS 65,000 is about. Now, if we go to next slide, I want to show you something very interesting. So the World Economic Forum. Now that's very unclear, so use your imagination, but you can go and download, if you Google WFE or WEF, risk report, the World Economic Forum risk report for 2020, right in the beginning of this document, you're going to find their risk map. So just work with me. If you go to the left quadrant where it talks about impact on the vertical axis, and then the possibility that this would happen on the horizontal axis. So if you look there at the top, there's a little yellow dot, and then just next to it, there's a red dot. Now that red dot there sits at and just above average impact and a very below average possibility that this might occur. And guess what? That is a biological pandemic. So the World Economic Forum, with all their thinkers, when they did their risk mapping for the world for 2020, for them, a pandemic was not really high up on that canvas. And now we know that that actually shifted right to the top end of that particular matrix. So I think, again, also underscoring the point, ladies and gentlemen, that we mustn't become, or we mustn't romanticize organizational resilience as a pure cause and effect managerial practice or leadership practice. We don't always know what's coming, and the WEF also did not know what was coming. Thank you, Kobus, for posting that link in the chat box. So let's hop to next slide, and I want to introduce you to this particular graphic, right? So on the vertical axis there, I'm not sure how clear you can see that, but on the vertical axis there, you've got impact, and then you've got time on the horizontal axis. So now if you look at the red part where we dipped very, very low in terms of the effect on the organization, I think a lot of organizations globally are sitting in that highly negative impact zone, so to speak, because of the mere fact that we didn't expect this, we didn't see this coming, we never modeled this, we never built this, or few of us actually built this or these into our strategies. And so the idea with organizational resilience is that little green part to reduce the negative impact and to actually up your curve towards profitability and positive effect on the organization. So the slide simply sells you this idea that preparedness in terms of going forward, in terms of organizational resilience, to be able to deal with these impacts really depends on planning and being prepared and being able to recover very fast. Okay, so in our next slide, I want to share with you an idea that I find a lot when you read about organizational resilience and you talk to people in organizations who are involved in risk. They will say to you, well, you know what, given what has happened in COVID, uh, the organizational resilience function, if you want to call it a function, although I wouldn't think it's a function, I would think it's a philosophy that then gets built in all the aspects of the business. But they want to peg that in terms of ERM, enterprise risk management, and they built 4 pillars around that. Okay, so first one is business interruption modeling, which sells us this idea that going forward, we as businesses have to model. We have to model specific possibilities. I know Bill Gates very much, I think a year or two ago, if it was not at the WEF, if I'm not mistaken, they were trying to model this whole idea that if a pandemic struck the world, you know, what would happen? And apparently that modeling didn't really find its way into mainstream business, but that's important. Supply chain assessment, we know that just after the appearance of the pandemic, there were huge issues around supply chain disruption. So absolutely, especially in terms of global supply chains, a lot of countries are very dependent on imports, sometimes of vital products and services. Then, of course, there is the whole issue of business continuity management, which I want to talk about at a bit more length in about a minute or so. And then, of course, business impact analysis. But the point being that for a lot of business thinkers at this point, building business resilience and remaining profitable is really part of risk management. Now, you can make up your mind about that. One, I could see it being part of risk management, but I could also see it being part of the overall strategy of the business, as well as infusing that into operations. Now, the next slide shows you another approach, and you can also go and Google these guys. It's a wonderful organization, the International Consortium of Organizational Resilience. And they've picked 6 or 12 areas in the business, which they say you've got to make these things resilient, such as your human resources. There they've put risk second from the bottom right, as part of the resilience framework. I happen to agree more with this particular model, ICT certainty, etc. So they take, I would think, a more holistic view on organizational resilience, and they sell us the idea that actually developing a culture of resilience in the organization. Now, just as you would do, I guess, total quality management and lean management and so on, I would guess that organizational resilience becomes part of that, where we make everything absolutely efficient and make them highly resilient. So should there be some kind of shock, we are able to recover very quickly in that particular area. Okay, in the next slide, I've attempted here, ladies and gents, to add my little bit to the modeling part. So just to do a quick explanation, I think if you talk about organizational resilience, you have to be very aware of what is your organizational nucleus. So in my approach, I'm saying any organization, if I stripped all the fat and the waste away, what would be my nucleus? What would define my organization that if I reduced it by one more percentage point, it would not be my organization anymore? So that's a very flexible concept, because agile organizations aspire then to break into and grow into their competitive environment. So, for example, there's a strategic target that says we want to increase market share by 15%, or whatever the case might be. So we stretch ourselves into the competitive environment, but that leaves us vulnerable. We know that large conglomerates, very vulnerable. There are huge risks involved, so we become quite open and vulnerable to risks. And then it becomes even more difficult when forces, external forces and threats impact on that competitive environment. So resilience then has to be, in my view, the ability to then, and I hate to use the word shrink, I would say revert back to that nucleus, or as close to that nucleus as I possibly can, with all my contingency plans in place, the way my human resources will be restructured. In fact, even my cash flows, in other words, mitigating that risk beforehand by having a minimum cash flow available should some force or threat attack the organization. So for me, organizational resilience is not an either or, a binary concept. It's a very fluid motion, if I could put it that way, but I have to know what is my organizational resilience, or nucleus rather. So let's pop across to our next slide. And I want to share some more standards with you, specifically two standards, ladies and gentlemen. And this one comes from the International Organization for Standardization. So please go and have a look at their website, ISO 22301, which really talks here about security and resilience. And there's the magic word for me: business continuity management system. So if you drop your eyes a bit down, it talks about specifying requirements to plan, establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, maintain, and continually improve. And another star word for me, or definition, documented management system. So now we talk about evidence-based management to do what? To protect against, to reduce the likelihood of occurrence. Now we know we don't have control over the risk of a pandemic. We've realized that. But the preparation and responding and the recovering from those incidents. Now, this is where we are currently sitting. I'm trying to sell you the idea that we need to move with organizational resilience in that planning and in that establishment. We need to move ahead of the curve, so to speak, so that we are not reactive, but that we are proactive in our responses to something like a COVID pandemic. So on the next slide, I just expand the idea for you more. Still the same. So you can just drop down a little bit there from, there we go. So it's still the same ISO, and I've just sort of cherry picked from this particular ISO. And it's the PRRR that we're talking about. Yeah, and it really talks about preparation through awareness, analysis, and learning That's very important. I believe, ladies and gents, that companies will have to go back to the data that they have now harvested from this event. And they need to analyze that data. So this is management by evidence. They need to analyze that. They need to project forward and then strategize based on this data. So how did this affect us? Where could we analyze? Were we in any case not lean enough to deal with this? Where did we really hemorrhage cash, people, equipment, contracts, everything, all the data that we can gather to prepare, God forbid, for a next event such as this? It's the P triple R. So the second R is to respond, coping. Now, currently, yes, that's where we are. We're trying to cope with the immediate effects, but most of our businesses don't have a plan. So what you tend to do is the scalpel approach, cut, cut, cut. And you can't fault that right now, right? But unfortunately, I think the last I read, there was 3 million job losses. Now that's in an economy with 58 million people, with 10 million having been employed before COVID struck. That's huge. That's massive. So with organizational resilience, what we try and do is to model, to try and project what would be those effects and how do we cope with that. And practical things, which I'm going to talk in a moment about. The second R, managing people. We know, I just spoke about the job losses, salary cuts that were implemented, um, contracts for upstream, downstream in the value chain with large organizations that fell over, small businesses, one man, one woman, little businesses, PTY limiteds, all taking a serious knock. So people have been severely affected. And then the last are continuing to support the workforce after returning to business as usual. I'm going to talk at the end about the resilience of the workforce. So just take note of that one. So on the next slide, I'm going to introduce you to another ISO, I think. There we go. Closely related. So just scroll down a little bit more. There we go. Okay. So ISO 22, just a bit up. Thank you. ISO 22331 really works hand in hand with 22301. And this is the one I just want to spend a bit of time on, because this one specifically then talks about business continuity management systems. You'll remind yourself when I showed you the risk sketch in the beginning, or the graphic, and I said people want to link this to risk. And one of the legs or pillars it was standing on was this one, business continuity management systems. I think, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to coin this morning a specific managerial discipline for developing organizational resilience in the organization, it would be business continuity management. I'm not going to have a conversation where we house this. Is it risk? Does it sit with a senior exec, with a team? Is it a task team type thing? I mean, companies can decide how they're going to do it, but I think the philosophy and approach with regards to business continuity management systems is very important. And then they start selling us the idea that the organizational business continuity strategy. I like that. I like that. So I think in future, when we pick up an integrated report of an organization, and I know organizations do report on that, and it kind of like gets lost somewhere there in the risk report somewhere. But I think BCMS, or business continuity management, for shareholders, for stakeholders, to be able to know, okay, what is it that you are doing proactively to develop organizational resilience in light of what has happened with COVID specifically? So can we see that in your strategy? Is there a strategic thrust or a separate strategy that specifically focuses on business continuity management? Okay, so those strategies would include things like protecting and prioritizing activities, stabilizing, continuing, all those things that I've written there for you, which becomes part of that vernacular in strategy. So let's drop down to our next slide. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to spend some time on this particular model, ladies and gentlemen. This is really, for me, the nucleus of business continuity management. So the first one at the top there talks about business impact analysis and risk assessment. So if you look at that as a separate approach in management, you want management to be able to identify the product service delivery requirements and the prioritized time frame. So what does that mean? That means when we now rethink the way our businesses reacted to COVID, what is it in terms of time frames, activities, recoveries, in terms of our product and service delivery that we can do differently? A lot of organizations have gone the online marketing route, the online sales route. They were forced into that. They might not have had a very well-defined strategy just post-COVID, but we now know we need to think about that. The other one we need to think about that in terms of business impact is, what are the resources we're going to need? So think about my model where I said, you think nucleus. When we go back, when we retreat from the battlefield, where will we be safe and where will we be able to rebuild? And what are the resources that we need for that? I'm thinking about things like facilities. A lot of companies now understand they don't need the floor space. I'm sorry for those of you sitting here who are in office retail, but I think unfortunately for you, fortunately for businesses, they are going to have to reduce floor space. That's for sure. Think about things like technology assets. Right now, organizations are reacting by dispersing that, by decentralizing that. So it sits on a laptop, on a desk somewhere in a house where business is done from. So we would have to look at the resources we need. For me, the big one, and I hope there are some financial people on this call. I think companies are going to have to rethink things like their liquidity ratios. They might be very highly geared. I'm thinking about FMCG companies in terms of their short run liquidity. You might have to build in higher levels of liquidity. I'm thinking about solvency even. You might have to lessen your gearing. So hence my sketch about our aspiration, because our aspirations are going to be affected. And we know we drive aspiration by often borrowing very heavily in the South African environment. That's going to have to relooked. In terms of risk assessment, of course, we have to do risk analysis like we always do, but this time around we also have to look at the possibility of a pandemic striking. The second bubble to the right there, the business continuation strategy, what does that address? Well, it addresses the outcomes of our impact analysis, right? So we did the data, we ran the data, we did the risk analysis, and we now know where is our nucleus organization, what we can withstand, how we can withstand it, and now we need to develop a business continuity strategy. So that one should enable us to resiliently deal with a range of disruptive incidents. For example, we need to have in that strategy the capability or to almost predict the frequency of these incidents and the impact of those incidents, the finance resources needed, the communication capabilities needed. I'm just thinking about companies that were caught heavily off guard in terms of their primary supply chain, where communication dropped. Companies were so centralized in terms of that communication. When everybody started working from home, a lot of that had to be reset. The other one I'm thinking about, alternate workspace capabilities, accessibility to workspaces and so forth, availability of personnel, loss information. There's quite a lot that the strategy can actually recover from. So in terms of the business continuity procedures, the ISO that I'm dealing with, ladies and gentlemen, is very clear on that it should be a very well documented process. It's almost as if you're saying, if this happens, then here are the following responses that should happen. Hence, I'm still selling the idea that there should be a particular function in the organization that has a look at that. And then, of course, in terms of any standard, we are saying, let's model this thing. That's the exercise and the testing. Let's run some simulations. However we do that, let's regather some data and redo the business impact, refine the strategy, and refine the procedures that we'll put in place to be able to withstand that particular pandemic or risk that hits the organization. So let's pop across to next slide. So there's the point, ladies and gentlemen. There's no single strategy or solution to make an organization resilient, but we can all enhance our resilience by strengthening the management disciplines of the organization that manage risk. And so what we want is an integrated and coordinated uh, management of business continuity or resilience continuity. So we can have a deep philosophical conversation about that, because the second point says you need to build a culture that ensures the organization behaves in a healthy manner. Now, what does that mean? I mean, non-managerial people don't have an effect on this. So I want to peg that at the leadership level, wherever you want to peg leadership, and say to you that I think from now on forward, just being lean and mean is not the full answer. I think being lean, mean, and resilient would be the answer. And how do we develop resilience? Well, one thing that I can just think of is doing a resilience audit in the organization. And there we involved everybody. I mean, I'm going to share with you Carter's change model towards the end of my chat here. But if you want to build a real culture of resilience, you have to involve your people in the organization who work at the coal face to be able to provide you with data. So, for example, the receiving people at the uh, dock of a call it a food retailer where the supplies are delivered will be able to provide you with quite a lot of data. If you ask them a simple question, you said, what if we hit a situation where there's another pandemic? What would you suggest? What do you think can we do to maintain the supplies, lean up the supplies, and make us more resilient? And ladies and gentlemen, I mean, King speaks about the human capital as one of the 6 capitals, the intellectual capital. I think as business managers and leaders, when we want to build a culture of resilience, we have to involve our people in the data gathering process. They know things that you and I don't know, who sit in an office far away. They know things. Okay, the third point, increasing its adaptive capacity, ability to manage change. Again, I go back to it's got to be well documented. It's got to be a very visible process with very visible procedures, almost a paint by numbers, if you may, that the organization has to have a full transparent view on. And I'm talking here about even the most junior non-managerial staff member. If I'm in a household and I'm a child and I know we're going to drive somewhere and there is the risk of an accident, I want my dad or my mom to tell me beforehand, listen, if this happens, then this is who you phone, then this is what you do, then. Now, I find it actually funny to a degree that a lot of organizations keep these things quite under a blanket, because apparently people will not be able to handle the honesty or the transparency. I think we're beyond that now, because when COVID hit, um, those that were the most affected were those down the pecking order. They lost their jobs. So for me, just from an organizational behavior point of view, it's very important that we make it as visible as possible. So I end this slide off by saying each of these aspects plays an important role in building a more resilient organization, but it should be a framework and it should be an integrated strategy. You can add the word there. It has to be foregrounded now. We cannot, ladies and gents, after COVID, we just simply cannot stick our heads in the sand and say, well, we hope this is not going to happen again, or we hope that when it happens, we have a vaccine. How do we know whether COVID-19 plus 3 doesn't hit the shores next year? We don't know. We really don't have any control. So I believe that a integrated strategy looking into the future is the best way to go. So on the next slide, and I'm returning now finally to the British standard, 65,000. which really says, okay, fine, Jacques, you want to convince the decision makers in this organization about your organizational resilience and your business continuity management system approach and your strategy approach and your risk approach. So what do we do? So if you pick up the standard, the BS 65,000, it becomes very practical, and it says, you know what, this will not work unless you've got top level backing. But we do know that that is true for everything in the organization. So just like King would say in the King report, an ethical culture is driven from the top down. I believe organizational resilience and the strategy should be driven from the top down. It has to be a strategy. You have to develop the business case. If you want to go back to your board, for example, and you want to ask for resources, especially in this time when resources are quite thinly spread, just think about the cash positions of organizations. So you want another 12 million over 3 years to build an organizational resilience department, a culture. What is the business case? What are the facts around this? And I'm sure that some of the financial people will come up with some amazing return on investment calculations that they can do here, or countering the loss calculation, because we took so much loss, we need to reduce that loss, which equals the benefit, the cost benefit for the organization. However you do that, it's evidence based. We have to, it can, that's why I said to you in the beginning, it cannot be romanticized. I mean, COVID-19 is not romantic. Speak to people who've been affected. Look at the infection rates, the death rates. We cannot romanticize this thing. It's not, it can't remain a philosophy. It's got to become a business case. Then, of course, the development of a particular approach, a framework, a structure, everything that you can find to document this thing, which is the next point. Document the model, foreground the model. Of course, rolling out the program, I want to include there for you first simulations. It also becomes part of the change management issue. For example, people know that should situation X arise, there will be a 15% reduction in salaries in order to retain 90% of the workforce. Okay, people need to know that. So if we talk about rolling out the program, again, God forbid we don't have to roll it out with a new COVID pandemic, but it's also about preparing your people, which will be the last segment of my talk today, but preparing your people by simulating, by giving them access to what are the actions when certain things do happen. So how will we roll out this program? And then, ladies and gentlemen, typically of implementing a standard, it's to repeat the behaviors, to measure them continuously, and to keep on improving on them. So I don't know, maybe there are some of you sitting here that say, well, you know what, the organization needs an absolute separate business continuity management desk, executive plus senior team, plus analysts, whatever the case might be. Or you might say, no, this should reside under the COO, who's got a senior risk manager who, reports to her or him. And so there has to be a separate function that should be developed. Maybe some of you are sitting and saying, well, if you want to drive this culture of resilience, we have to make it part of job descriptions, of KPIs. Just make it absolutely visible and get people to participate therein. Okay, so next slide, ladies and gents, I want to drive the conversation to the people. So we know that human capital is probably, in my view, one of the top 3 capitals of the 6. We also do know that with COVID, not just here in South Africa, if you look at the States as well, even though they might say they're recovering on that front, but job losses are huge. I always, when I speak to people about COVID and the effect of COVID on the economy and business, I'm saying, listen, this was just the first twitch of the tail. There's going to be about 2 or 3 further swishes of that big tail that's going to affect us. The stories are coming out now. Small businesses that had to close down. So you talk about formal 3 million job losses. What about the informal economy, where people were under lockdown for how long, losing just that subsistence survivalist kind of economic activity that they actioned during the day. It's huge, it's massive, and I think it's still going to come back with 2 or 3 more swishes of that tail. So I want to focus on people here for the next 10 minutes or so. So here we say in terms of people, resilience is the psychological quality that allows people to be knocked down, some people, by the adversities of life, but then they come back at least as strong as before. So rather than letting difficulties, traumatic events, or failure overcome them and drain their resolve, highly resilient people find a way to change course, emotionally heal, continually moving toward their goal. Let me first chat about senior management and leadership in the organization. Ladies and gentlemen, you might not agree with what I'm saying now, but let me say it. I do think, in South Africa especially, that at the top end of the organization, and I know those of you who know me well over the years will know this is my hobby horse, this thing. How can we ethically justify that during this time and just post-COVID, the very high levels of remuneration at the top end of the organization just persists, continues, yet we shed 30% of jobs. And from a strategic point of view, that is quite justified. And I put the justify in inverted commas. I think if you talk resilience, some of our top leaders, top management in organizations have to take a very long, hard look at the human capital component and the remuneration um, component in the organization, and rather have a policy or an approach with resilience in place where there's a more equitable redistribution or distribution of remuneration, and rather maintain people or keep people in the organization, retrain them, reduce their salaries, but at least allow them to look after their family. So I don't think we need to have a war zone approach where some survive and some don't. So in that regard, ladies and gentlemen, it takes a lot of resilience of someone who's been earning at a certain level to say, I'm quite prepared to take a 30% drop for the next 2 years in order to rebuild the human capital in my organization. It's a very personal question. And yeah, let's not, dive into that too deeply, but that's part of resilience. The other part of resilience, and I'm not going to look at the effect now of COVID, because we know a lot of people have lost their jobs and it becomes personal hardship. And I mean, how do you get up from this if you've lost everything? It's very difficult. So let's talk about those whom we retain in the organization, those who made it back, to their desk, so to speak, with all sensitivity that I could muster. How do we keep them resilient? Because you must remember one thing. Just drop down one slide for me, please. You know, that's the thing, right? So it's forced change. So working conditions have shifted. We just had a conversation before coming on air about, you know what, when we were in an office, we could say, I'm out. Now you can't say I'm out. No, you got connectivity. Kobus was saying, like, these meetings are now back to back, because you're not driving somewhere. At least, I mean, even in Gauteng, when we drive somewhere, at least it's somewhat relaxing, to a degree, because at least you get out and you see other people and cars and whatever. Now there you sit. So working conditions have shifted. And I'm talking about white collar environment. What about blue collar environment? Shifts have shifted. There's been restructuring around that. So it's huge impact. Personal lives have been affected because of this forced change. We know about that. People's financial situation, also companies, but people's financial situations have shifted dramatically. Our movement has been curtailed, which for a human being is quite difficult. We are a social being. We want to be in contact with others, especially in the work environment. Okay, so movement have been curtailed. Yes, it's had its positive effects. I was sharing with the group beforehand yesterday. I did a business conversation with a South African from Benoni in Serbia, serving me with a particular product. Phenomenal. So positively, yes, movement has changed, but physical movement has definitely been curtailed. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the future. Kobus always likes to say that he's been to the future, he's come back, and it's looking good. I want to believe that. I'm just as positivist as he is. And I believe you. I think human resilience is huge. And as humanity, we will make it back. But go to next slide for me, please. So that's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. The forced change for people have resulted in a lot of insecurity. So those that have made it back to your factory floor, those who've made it back to your stores, those who've made it back to your office environments, surely they cannot feel secure. So part of the continuation, the business continuation management approach and the building of a culture of resilience is to be honest with people about their job security. Now I know, when we're cynical, we say things like, "Yeah, you're as secure as your next paycheck." But surely we can do better than that as leadership and as management. And I'm not saying, from a legal perspective, we should overpromise on this issue and underdeliver. But if I know what's coming, and if I know, leadership strategy wise in this organization have made it very clear to me that if X+3 situation arises, this will be the result. This will be, the reduction in numbers, etc., etc. Then, at least from a personal perspective, I can try and make a plan to diversify in my own personal environment, and perhaps build in multiple income streams. Don't know, but insecurity is a huge issue. Frustration, ladies and gentlemen. Ooh, I think we're going to start seeing videos of, Zoom rage and MS Teams rage and things like that, because people are highly frustrated. Their personal circumstances have changed. It's frustration. There's reduced social contact. There's fear of the unknown. People don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what's coming. And again, management and leadership should create as much security. And we can only do that if we've got a structured approach to building organizational resilience. That loss of control goes without saying. People feel disempowered. There's a huge amount of stress out there. So I think all of this has moved this beyond just mere employee wellness and getting HR to write a nice email or refer people to a nice website to go and read up on stuff. Now, I think because it's human capital we are dealing with here, and I'm very passionate about that, I do believe this should become part of the overall strategy of business continuation, especially with our human capital approach. So surely we need to involve human resources, employee wellness, whomever, but it's got to link to the business strategy. This thing cannot stand on its own. So to next slide. So I still believe, ladies and gentlemen, that organizational resilience, especially now, has become more and more clear that it's a change management issue. It's an organizational development issue. Now, the model that I've brought up there for you is Kotter. And Kotter is very much about the proactive management of change, things like coalitions and urgency and communication and all that kind of stuff. Right now, I'm saying it will not be a bad idea for organizations to use change management and organizational development approaches, such as in OD, for example, town halls, small group meetings, change champions, all that lingo. Doing what? Um, Involving firstly all our employees in this resilience change approach, getting data from them, involving them in determining possible behaviors, possible reactions. In other words, getting great return on our human and intellectual capital and knowledge capital in the organization, and then involving them, in terms of assisting with some strategic thinking around this issue, and then, of course, empowering them. Number 5, empowering them with knowledge, knowing what what can be expected in certain scenarios. So even when we do certain simulations, getting them involved in that whole process. But I think when we use things like action research, which is part of organizational development, all of those things brings a lot of data to us as senior management and leadership to be able to work with. So, ladies and gentlemen, very definitely, those of you in your thinking who will be working with this going forward, do build your resilience thinking and strategy within the framework of a well-defined and well-established organizational change and development structure. Next slide there. Thank you. So this is my last slide, ladies and gentlemen. Um, I can't see too much of that, but it really talks about 4 actions to build resilience and reshape results. And it thinks about, number 1, it talks about putting people first. Now, please, I think, there we go. I think it could be a misnomer. It could be, I think, an error on the part of management and leadership in South Africa to just focus on the people component because we feel emotional. Perhaps we feel sorry for people. Perhaps, when we want to assist them, whatever the case might be. So I wouldn't prioritize or put this in priority. For me, it's like a little dashboard, and putting people first, definitely very important. However, if in that resilience strategy, I first have to establish the financial metrics, the financial parameters for this organization to be able to continue into the future, then I need to prioritize that. So I like to refer to co-prioritizing, because often in business we talk about priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think it's more of like a circle matrix, so to speak. But if the focus for now has to be on financial resilience, then that's where we focus. But people, very important. Number 2 there, communicate with stakeholders, including suppliers. Talks there about legal issues. It talks about a lot of things there. I think the stakeholder approach is becoming very clear in terms of building organizational resilience. I mean, it's that whole systems approach, isn't that so? We all are interdependent of each other. So, for example, thinking about something like payment of our creditors, you know, in terms of resilience and in terms of business continuity, there should be a section that deals with that. So, how do we communicate? How do we contract with our creditors in a new resilient era in terms of should cash flow issues arise? How do we spread this payment so that we all survive? The same with your debtors into your organization, or do you come down hard on them and you slap all sorts of interest and penalties on them because your cash flow is now in the red, and so they should just hoose and cough up and help your cash flow survive? Or are we proactive enough financially to say, listen, this is how we plan conservatively. Yes, there's a 90-day payment agreement, but we should actually work in this new world of post-COVID of resilience. We should work on 120 days. And then what are the agreements with them? So we need to think about these things. The strategy number 3, ladies and gentlemen, I spoke about. It encompasses everything in the organization. I think about production. I think about how do we resiliently in business continuity management planning, how do we document the possible shutdown of 40% of the factory? How do we discount that against a financial loss, etc.? But we need to make it very visible. Just something before I get to number 4, because that really talks about resilience and recovery and business continuity and so on. So I'm not even going to touch there because we spoke about that. It's all about how do we manage risk, isn't that so? I mean, we can ignore this thing and say, oh well, it's never going to happen again, or we can just try and avoid it, which is going to be very difficult. We certainly can't transfer this thing. I'm not sure how many of you sitting here are from the insurance houses. I don't know. Maybe there will be a policy on this thing coming from a Sanlam or one of those organizations for us to transfer if something does happen and there's a pandemic, so and it's not an act of God, so how much will the insurance houses pay? So I don't know, maybe we're going to see some new policies developing, but currently I don't think that kind of transferring is going to happen. So we're just going to have to face this thing, and we're going to have to proactively mitigate for when this happens, and how do we behave during that time. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's 50 minutes into my talk, so I'm actually going to shut off and ask our host to take questions for us, which I will attempt to answer for you, or perhaps there's somebody who's got a great input that you want to deliver. But thank you very much. Quivers, over to you then.
Jacques, thank you. Thank you very much for a insightful and pragmatic approach to this. So topical. It's things that's close to our skins on a daily basis. So thank you very much. You took us through a journey of starting off with the explanation of this as the ability of an organization to anticipate, prepare for, respond, and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. You also shared the International Consortium for Org Resilience framework, which I think it's a very valuable, and I suggest people really also go and find that after this. And I quite like your magic word, that of business continuity management systems. So in our planning, you reminded us to, if we want to stay ahead of the curve, to really now draw on these learnings and draw into our planning all the data that's being collected, and importantly, in preparation for the next event. So, I said or
God forbid, Quivers,
you said,
yes.
God forbid, this doesn't, yeah, it doesn't cross our paths again, but we have to be prepared. So, in terms of the coping, you also referred to the fact that so many businesses do not have a plan if we merely consider all these job losses. So the very important thing of this organizational resilience is to really include it in our strategic dialogue. If we haven't in the past, surely this now should become imperative going forward. So these operational planning and control that you refer to, of impact analysis and risk assessment, the business continuity strategy, the establishment and the implementation of business continuity procedures, and then exercising and testing that again. So, and you also shared about how do we enhance this within an organization, and firstly, the management practice. So strengthening the individual management disciplines, building that culture internally, and also increasing the employees' adaptive capacity as a collective. But the important thing then, of course, is to remind and take away, it has to become part of our business case. And from the organizational level, you also drill down to the individual level of the psychological quality of bouncing back stronger even after being knocked down, and the important role and function that management and leadership has in inculcating this into the organization. Because this forced change that you spoke about, and I was really reflecting on that, we as people, we like to control and plan things and do things the way we want it, when we want it, in the way, that type of thing. However, when it's forced and thrust upon us, you spoke about our working conditions, our personal lives, the financial issues, the freedom of movement, and the concerns about the future. So that resulting in our we're feeling insecure, frustrated, fear, stress. And when you went through that list, I could tick the boxes, then you kind of round it off. You put the ribbon around practical steps, 4 actions to build this. Really making people a very important and a very primary part of this building of the resilience, communicating with one's stakeholders, reshaping the strategy to maintain this continuity, and then of course to really build that resilience. So phenomenal. Thank you. My own notes is really also going to be turned into application. So we have a question there for you, Jacques. From Larissa, in the coping phase, organizations often implement retrenchments. So, in order to cope, they have to rid of people who will be then forced to look for ways to cope on their individual level. Um, Please comment in this from ethical and moral perspective. So, yeah.
Yeah, oh my word. Good question, that one. So, unfortunately, there's a lot of knee jerking happening. And I guess the soft target would be that item on that line item on the budget, which is employee cost to company. So that's the one that gets targeted always, even when COVID is not around. So it's unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, a very unhygienic management and leadership practice, especially in South Africa. We tend to do that very quickly because we can then show the business case is justified because look, we now pay 3 million a month less for salaries, so our cash position has improved. So we use that kind of, I would call it, um, excuse my French here, but dumb kind of causality to justify the action. I think it's highly unethical, especially in a country such as South Africa with high unemployment. And even those that have employment are hanging on tender hooks right now. So for me, going back to what I commented on about the redistribution of income in the organization, perhaps just reduction of salaries, already for me would be a much, across the board I'm talking about, already for me would be a much better strategy than what we are currently seeing.
Doc, thank you so much. Larissa, colleagues, there's still opportunity if you quickly want to pose a question, perhaps. But I think with all this wonderful information that we've been provided with, and I talk for myself, these things are mulling in my head now, and one is also self-reflective in the way in which one, as a manager or a leader, also applying these things or not, and the learnings that I could also take from this session, and really also apply them. The risk that one as in management and leadership positions run is also in times like this, feeling the same emotions, but then the risk of isolation and neglecting that the importance of really keeping the team as well, the mental or the mindset part of things, to, as a collective, address these things and look, considering the business continuity matters that's of cardinal importance. So, Jacques, in closing off, have you got a takeaway message for us and for South Africa, perhaps for further reflection as we journey into the rest of this day and the rest of this week and into the rest of this unfolding of events?
Jacobus, I actually do. I'm like you, I'm a positivist, right? So the sun will shine again, but I do think South Africa, its business leaders, its political leaders, would need to get beyond this fear phase where there's so much knee jerking going on. And we really do need to see plans emerging here. And if I may just pick on one here, which is really not either corporate or state, but it's the smaller businesses. I've always maintained that they are the driving force, and they will be the driving force and the backbone of the South African economy, because they do absorb quite a lot of the informal labor or the labor that is not registered, and they create opportunities and they create cash for families, if I use that as a nucleus. And I would love to see them becoming resilient. They are flattened. They've been flattened. It's a wasteland. And I just hope that those who are in a position of policy development will look at that particular sector and say, just as we've got business rescues and money is flowing to businesses and so forth after COVID from state, I do really believe that that's a sector that we need to look at. And I know people will say to you, but they're unregistered, they're not in the tax net, they don't deserve this. I'm saying no. We need to relook how the South African economy will operate after post-COVID or post-COVID. And I'm saying that sector we need to focus on. But thank you very much. I enjoyed this, and I hope you did too.
Absolutely. Jacques, thank you so much. Colleagues, a lot of takeaways here. And remember, this has been recorded. I personally also sometimes just like to come back again and pick up on some of these salient and important issues that came up. So it is recorded. I think there is also a feedback opportunity to provide us with some feedback for you. We really appreciate everyone that attended today. We wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and remember, tomorrow is beautiful. Looking forward to our next engagement. Bye-bye.